widely read and well-respected bloggers in the atheist blogosphere. She was recently a contender on the Blag Hag survey of some of the best and most influential female atheists. And I have to say I enjoy her blog quite a bit. She writes, she's been writing professionally since 1989, including sexuality, LGBT issues, politics, culture, atheism, and anything else that crosses her mind. We're very glad to have her here this weekend, given some extenuating circumstances in her personal life. So please help me welcome Greta Christina.
Liz, thank you so much. And I feel a little bit like a dinosaur because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So let's just pretend that I'm kicking it old school and not just that I'm ancient. Can everybody hear me okay? Do we need the mic or are we good? I'm sorry, would you want the mic? Okay, I can use the mic. Today I'm talking about what the atheist movement can learn from the gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement. The atheist movement is already modeling ourselves in a lot of ways on the LGBT movement, and we should. The parallels between the two movements are sometimes eerie. And since the LGBT movement is, in my estimation, about 35 years ahead of the atheist movement, I just think that we right now are about where the LGBT movement was in the early 70s, right after the Stonewall Riots. We have a unique chance to learn from that movement, both from its successes and from its failures. Before I move on, does everybody here know, who here knows about what the Stonewall Riots were? Okay, so most people do, a few people don't. Just a little bit of history for those who don't. The Stonewall Riots happened in June of 1969, and they're generally considered to be the event that sparked the modern gay movement. I mean, there had been a gay movement for decades before then, and had been starting to build up a certain head of steam, but in June of 1969, the police were raiding gay bars in New York like they've been doing for years, and on this particular night, the gay men and lesbians and transgender people and bisexuals fought back. I mean, literally fought back with throwing bricks at cops. And within a year, the gay movement had just completely transformed. That's basically when the movement became really visible, really vocal, really activist, better organized, more in your face. And so that's why I say where we are now in the atheist movement is about where the LGBT movement was in like the early 70s, shortly after that. It's like we're just beginning to get visible and vocal and in your face and organized. And therefore I think we have a lot to learn from the history of the LGBT movement. And I think probably the most important thing atheists can learn from the LGBT movement is to encourage visibility and coming out, and to work harder on making the atheist movement a safer place to come out into. Very early in the LGBT movement, it became clear that coming out is the single most important and powerful political act that gay people can take. Consistently, polls show that the single factor most likely to make people support gay rights is whether they know a gay person personally, or to be more accurate, whether they know that they know a gay person personally. And this is a lesson that the atheist movement has been taking to heart with the Out campaign, the atheist bus ads and billboards, and so on. We are doing an excellent job with visibility. We've gone from being pretty much on nobody's radar to being a major topic at water coolers and in op-ed columns in a really remarkably short time, and more atheists are coming out every day. But I think we're doing a less consistent job of making the atheist movement a safe place to land once people do come out. In the post-Stonewall days of the LGBT movement, there was a massive blossoming of LGBT community centers, bookstores, coffee houses, political groups, bars, bowling leagues, etc. Coming out as queer often meant leaving behind your friends and family. It still does for some people, but in the early 70s, it really meant that. And so queers formed our own social support networks to take the place of the ones that rejected us. And the atheist movement has not been as strong about this. Online we've done an excellent job of providing online communities for atheists, but we haven't done as good a job of providing in-the-flesh support networks to replace the churches and synagogues and mosques and covens and etc., and the sense of belonging and common purpose they provide for believers. And I'll own it, I will include myself in that. I am much better at participating in online communities than I am at showing up at local meetings. I can do it while I'm sitting on my sofa in my pajamas, and I'm overworked and lazy, and so I tend to do my organizing online. But I do think that one of the things we can learn from the LGBT movement is to remember how difficult coming out is. We need to remember that when we encourage people to rethink religion and to consider atheism, we're asking a lot. You know, we're not just asking people to reshape the entire philosophical foundation of their lives and to let go of a major source of comfort they've relied on for years. We're also asking them, in many cases, to alienate their friends and their family and their community. And I would like to see us do a better job of providing something to replace it with. Now, I will say, since this is a conference for the Secular Student Alliance, that college and university groups have to a great extent been an exception to this rule. Student groups have been providing a lot of in-the-flesh support and community for fledgling atheists. So what I'd like to do today is to encourage the leaders of those groups to continue that kind of community work even after you leave school. I'd like to see you carry that work into the non-college and university world and continue to build godless communities, not just online, but in the actual physical world. As Liz said earlier, student groups often have continuity problems, so I'd like to encourage student groups, as Liz talked about earlier, to be aware of that phenomenon and to make sure there's continuity within the in-the-flesh student groups they're providing. So there's another lesson that I think atheists can learn from the history of the LGBT movement. It took a little while to learn, and that's to let firebrands be firebrands and to let diplomats be diplomats. We need to recognize that not all activists pursue activism in the same way. We need to recognize that using both more confrontational and more diplomatic approaches makes us a stronger movement, and that both of these approaches used together synergistically are more powerful than either approach alone. To some extent, the LGBT movement is still learning this lesson, but we've become much better about it, and our movement has become stronger as a result. So here's an example. In the queer activist movement of the 80s and 90s, angry street activist groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation often accused more mild-mannered lobbying groups of assimilationism, excessive compromise, generally selling out, and the mild-mannered lobbying groups often accused the street activists of being overly idealistic, alienating potential allies, making their job harder. Is any of this sounding really familiar? But when we look at those years in retrospect, it becomes clear that both methods together were far more effective than either method would have been alone. Part of this is simply that different methods of activism speak to different people. Some folks are better able to hear a quiet, sympathetic voice. Others are better able to hear a passionate cry for justice. And the good cop, bad cop dynamic can be very, very effective. Again, in the queer movement of the 80s and 90s, the street activists got attention, got on the news, raised general visibility awareness. They got people, ACT UP, if nothing else, got people saying the word AIDS. Not just, people, ordinary people and people in the media. And then the polite negotiators could then raise a more polite, nuanced version of hell, knowing that the people they were working with at least had a baseline awareness of these issues, had at least heard of them. And when the street activists presented more hardline demands, that made the polite negotiators seem more reasonable in compromise, in comparison. The line between an extremist position on LGBT issues and a moderate one keeps getting moved in our direction. One of the ways we see this working today is with the same-sex marriage debate. I mean, it's obviously a huge issue, all over America. It's been a very tough fight. It continues to be a very tough fight. But one of the effects of the same-sex marriage debate has been that it's made supporting civil unions and domestic partnerships seem like the moderate position and even the conservative position. And that was not true 10 years ago. So one of the things that extremists can do is to just sort of push the line of what's considered the moderate position. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't debate our tactical differences. On any given particular issue, it is sometimes worth debating whether diplomacy or confrontation or a combination of the two will be a more effective tactic in that particular case. But I'd like us to stop treating those debates as if they were larger questions of morality and character that have to be resolved in one direction or the other once and for all. We all do what we're inspired to do, and we do what we're good at. Some of us are good at passionate confrontational idealism. Some of us are good at sympathy with our opponents, and some of us are good at a mix of these approaches. So the diplomatic atheists really need to stop trying to shut up the firebrands and stop accusing them, okay, stop accusing us of alienating people. And the firebrand atheists need to stop accusing the diplomats of being wusses. It's really a waste of everybody's time and energy. Speaking of wasting everybody's time and energy, there's a third very important lesson that the godless movement can learn from the LGBT movement, and that's to not waste our time squabbling about language. We need to let godless people use whatever language they want to define themselves. There is again an eerie parallel between the non-theist movement and the LGBT movement. It's a similarity between two relationships. The relationships between homosexuals and bisexuals on the one hand, and the relationship between atheists and agnostics on the other. So, I identify as a bisexual, and in the past I've had to put up with a fair amount of crap from people who identify as gay or lesbians, who tell me that I'm, quote, really a lesbian, and just won't admit it. And that's really not helpful. The question of how to name and own your own sexual identity is extremely personal, and different factors have different weight for different people. I'm personally about a Kinsey 5. That's the Kinsey sexual orientation scale, 0 to 6. 0 is entirely heterosexual, 6 is entirely homosexual. I'm about a Kinsey 5. I'm mainly oriented towards women, but I have some interest in men. And I call myself bisexual, because to me, that interest in men, it's secondary, but it's not trivial. It's included important relationships, it's an important part of how I view the world, etc. But for somebody else who's a Kinsey 5, I promise this isn't irrelevant, I'll wrap it back to atheism in a minute. For somebody else who identifies as a Kinsey 5, that some interest in the opposite sex, it might not be that important to them. It's just kind of, yeah, sometimes I'm interested in people of the opposite sex, but whatever. And so they might call themselves gay or lesbian, which is totally their right, just like it's totally my right as a Kinsey 5 to call myself bisexual. These terms don't have clear definitions everyone agrees on. There's not a perfect bisexual in a vacuum in the Smithsonian that we all can measure ourselves against. And within reason, we have a right to use this language in a way that makes sense for us. So, did everybody see where I'm going with this? Let's look at the Richard Dawkins belief scale, which goes from 1 to 7, 1 being absolute certainty that there is a God, and 7 being absolute certainty that there isn't. I'm about a 6 on the Dawkins scale. It's 6.5.
So is he.
I'm sorry?
So is he.
So is he, exactly. Dawkins isn't even a 7 on the Dawkins scale. And as a 6 on the Dawkins scale, I call myself an atheist. Because to me, that little glimmer of uncertainty about, God, it's not very important to me. I can't be sure there isn't a God. I can't be sure there aren't unicorns either. Who cares? It's hypothetically possible I'm wrong. It's not keeping me up at night. But somebody else who's a 6 on the Dawkins scale, for them, that little glimmer of uncertainty might be really important to them. And even if they have exactly the same amount of doubt that I do, the fact of that doubt might really matter to them. So even though we're in the same place on the Dawkins scale, it's totally reasonable for them to call themselves agnostic, while I call myself an atheist. Again, there is no perfect atheist in a vacuum in the Smithsonian. This language is really imprecise, the language is evolving, and the power to name ourselves is too important for us to try to take it away from each other. So, in the same way that gays and lesbians have, for the most part, learned to quit telling bisexuals that they're really gay or lesbian and just won't admit it, I think atheists need to quit telling agnostics that they're really atheist and just won't admit it. By the same token, just like bisexuals have to quit saying everybody's basically bisexual, agnostics have to shut up about how most atheists are really agnostic, and how true atheism as a belief system is just as much as religion, etc. Atheists and agnostics are natural allies, along with humanists, skeptics, materialists, naturalists, freethinkers, brights, etc. Much like gays and lesbians and bisexuals and transgendered people are all natural allies. And we shouldn't waste our time and energy squabbling because you say tomato and I say tomato. And I want to close with one more lesson that the atheist movement can learn from the LGBT movement. There are more. I could go on about this for hours, especially if you put a beer in my hand, but time is running out, so I'm going to leave you with this, and this is a really important lesson that atheists can learn, not from the successes of the LGBT movement, but from one of our biggest failures, and it's a failure that has come back to bite us in the ass time and time again. Atheists need to work now on making our movement more diverse and making it more welcoming and inclusive of women and of people of color. And by now, I mean it now, today, 5 years ago. We need to start on this now so we don't get set into patterns and vicious circles and self-fulfilling prophecies that in 10 or 20 years will be damn near impossible to fix. And what we can learn from the LGBT movement is that the LGBT movement screwed this up and badly. The early LGBT movement was very much dominated by gay white men. The public representatives of the movement were mostly gay white men. Most organizations were led by gay white men. And the gay white male leaders had some seriously bad race and gender stuff. They treated gay men of color as fetishistic others, objects of sexual desire, rather than members of the community. And they treated lesbians as these alien others, inscrutable but trivial. And we're paying for it today. Relationships between lesbians and gay men, and between white queers and queers of color, are often strained at best. Conversations in our movement about race and gender take place in a decades-old minefield of rancor and bitterness where nothing anybody can say will ever be right. And we still, after decades, have a strong habitual tendency to put gay white men front and center as the most visible, iconic representatives of our community. Anybody thinking about the Four Horsemen right now? And this makes it hard on everybody in the LGBT movement, women and men of all races. It creates rifts that make our community weaker, and it has a seriously bad impact on our ability to make effective social change. For instance, the LGBT movement has a profoundly impaired ability to shift homophobic attitudes in the Black communities, since those communities can claim entirely fairly and entirely justly that the gay community doesn't care about Black people and hasn't made an effort to deal with our racism. And that really hit us with the Prop 8 battle. There was a lot of publicity about how Black people voted against, same-sex marriage in California in disproportionate numbers, and those numbers were actually really, really inflated. But what we did find was that the Black people African Americans who are involved in the Black churches voted against same-sex marriage in California, because people in all churches voted against same-sex marriage in California. But if we had been doing a better job for the last 20 years, doing outreach and connecting with the Black churches, who are for the most part pretty politically progressive, I think that would not have gone against us as badly as it did. So we screwed this up. We still screw this up, and we are paying for our screw-ups. Atheists have a chance to not do that. This is a really early time in our movement, and we have a chance to start to get this right. The atheist movement is currently largely dominated by white men, especially in positions of visibility and leadership. And many atheists resist seeing this as a problem that we need to take action on. I think that they're not overtly racist or sexist. They're not saying we don't want women or people of color in the movement, but they don't see this as their responsibility, and they don't see it as a very high priority. I could again give an entire talk about why this is important and why this is a high priority. I could give a talk about how racism and sexism aren't always conscious, how we perpetuate them without even thinking about them, and therefore need to pay conscious attention to countering them. I could talk about how people tend to focus on issues, naturally, that personally affect them. So an atheist movement dominated by white men will focus on issues that largely affect white men at the expense of issues that largely concern women and people of color. I could give an entire talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, how even if the predominant whiteness and maleness of the atheist movement were purely accidental, even if it had just happened by some zapping of the quantum woo of the world, the pattern would still get perpetuated and ingrained because women and people of color feel less welcome in a movement that's largely white and male, and the less welcome they/we feel, the longer the movement goes on being largely white and male, and the circle keeps going around. But I realize my time is limited, so mostly I want to say this. look at every other movement for social change in recent history. Not just the LGBT movement, the labor movement, the feminist movement. Every other movement that I know about has been bitten on the ass by this issue. Every single movement for social change that I know of has wishes now that they'd taken action on it in the early days of the movement, before these bad habits and these self-fulfilling prophecies got set into this deep groove that's really hard to break out of. And that definitely includes the LGBT movement. There's lots of good reasons for atheists to work on this. There's idealistic reasons. Religion hurts women and people of color as much as it hurts men. Female atheists and atheists of color matter just as much as white male atheists. If we're not connecting with them, we're not reaching all the atheists that we could be. And there's practical reasons for doing this, just purely Machiavellian success of our movement reasons. It will make our movement stronger, it will make our movement better, it will make our movement better at reaching more people. But if you're still wondering why this is important, really talk to anybody who's seriously involved in LGBT politics and ask them, if you could go back to 1970 and get the early leaders of the post-Stonewall movement to deal with race and sex, would you do it? I can guarantee you that just about everyone would fervently respond, yes, for the sweet love of Loki and all the gods in Valhalla, if we could go back in time and not screw this up, we would. We in the atheist movement have a chance to not screw this up. We have a chance to start dealing with this now, so it's less of a problem in 10 or 20 years, and we're not wasting our time and energy 10 or 20 years from now trying to fix what we could be fixing now. Let's learn from the mistakes of the LGBT movement as well as from its successes, and let's take advantage of that chance. Thank you.
Take a couple questions?
Sorry. Questions?
So do you think there is some value in having sniping back and forth between the firebrands and diplomats, in making the diplomats seem more diplomatic and the firebrands seem fiery? Or do you think it's counterproductive to have them publicly calling each other names?
So the question is there any value in the debate slash sniping between firebrands and diplomats? I think it depends. I think that, like I said, I think that if we're talking about some particular issue, it's sometimes worth debating on this particular issue in this particular instance. Is it more worth taking a more firebrand approach, or is it more worth taking a diplomatic approach? What I think is a waste of time is debating it as if it were a larger philosophical issue. I mean, I think that, it's like I don't want to shut anybody up, and I don't want to, part of what I'm saying is I don't want to shut anybody up. I don't want to tell the diplomats to shut up. And that includes not wanting to tell them to shut up when they think I'm wrong. I want to hear a good argument for why, if I'm being too much of a hard ass, or if I'm being not a hard ass enough, I want to hear a good argument for why that's so I can clarify. I think the main benefit that we can get out of it is that it just clarifies our own thinking. And it helps us strategize more effectively. Part of strategizing is debating, and part of strategizing is conflict. So I think that there is some benefit, but what I think the debates tend to degenerate into debates about whether confrontation or diplomacy is more effective always, whether it's just more philosophically superior or whether it's always the best approach. And that's what I'd like to see us stop doing, because that's what I think is a waste of time. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, okay. We got to talk about this very briefly earlier, but I'd love to hear if you had anything else to say, or if you wanted to go a little bit more in depth about it. But I was at the American Atheist Convention 2 weeks ago, and I heard Todd Steipel make a really great comparison between the queer movement and our movement that really highlighted something that I believe very strongly in, which was he said that our movement needs to model ourselves after the queer movement in respect to having partnerships with religious organizations. So like the queer movement has really gained a lot of traction by using straight allies, relationships with straight communities. He suggested that we should do the same type of thing, and I was curious what your thoughts on that.
So the question is whether the atheist movement, the LGBT movement, has become stronger by aligning with straight organizations like the ACLU and so on, and can the atheist movement partner with progressive and ecumenical religious organizations to make ourselves stronger? I think to some extent we can, and to some extent we can't. And I think one of the differences, like we were talking about earlier, is that gay people aren't telling straight people you're mistaken to be straight. And atheists kind of are, and I think we kind of need to own up to that, even if that's not the centerpiece of our activism, of our publicity. Just by saying I'm an atheist, we're basically saying if you believe in God, I think you're wrong. And some of us are being a lot more proactive about actually trying to persuade people out of religion. And I think that that's something that progressive believers are going to have a hard time with, which is understandable. It's hard to ally with somebody whose core mission around which they're organizing is that they're wrong. That being said, though, a lot of progressive ecumenical and religious organizations do want to partner with atheists, or at least they think they want to. They want to until they actually start talking with us, and then they sometimes change their mind. But I think that that's been my experience anyway. The number of times that somebody has said, I really want to engage in dialogue with you, it's like as a believer, but I want to understand, and then it's like 10 minutes into the conversation, they're like, never mind, screw you. But what I do think we can do is say, okay, look, we really disagree on this question of God, but we agree on separation of church and state. We agree on, atheists, we agree on all these other issues about, freedom of religious expression and separation of church and state. And so I think that we can work with progressive religious groups about issues where we have some commonality, but I think we need to accept that we have this really core difference and it may not be able to get past it. Yes?
Oh man. Firstly, fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
And I'm going to be bugging you about this lots more.
Okay, thanks.
Partly because next month, May 16th in Washington, D.C., the African Americans for Humanism are having a conference at the Center for Inquiry, D.C., first of its kind, on this sort of thing, reaching out to the Black community, specifically with atheism and humanism and all of this stuff. I'm speaking there about how to do it, and I don't know what the hell I'm going to say yet, because I haven't written my talk, but I'll be talking with you about that and hopefully getting some pointers. So attempts are being made. There was also a community group in Harlem that ended up, right now they're not very strong, but they're attempting to make strides there. But I do have a question in here, which is, I went to Temple University. It's got the first African American Studies program and the largest African American Studies program currently. It's a very diverse campus. They say it's the most diverse school in the nation. I tried to start a Free Thinkers Club there, and I was shot down. I was told that I was turning my back on my own, that humanism equaled European hegemonic domination, blah, 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 blah. And I've heard the way that we give our presentation sometimes, particularly in regards to humanism, and sometimes when we use the term atheism, Paul Kurtz even says, the Greeks they invented science and philosophy, and then the Christians in the Dark Ages and all of this, until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment rebirthed it all. Well, that's one very small part of the world. What happened to China? What happened to Africa? What happened to everywhere else? And then we say, join us! Help us carry forward the torch of the Enlightenment. Well, you try telling that to an African American Studies major who spent any time learning about, Afrocentrism and all of this, and they're just already like, blinders on, what the hell are you talking about? Why are you trying to make me be like you? So I think there's a way that we can deliver our message. I was supposed to make this into a question. What do you think of that?
There's a very good African American atheist writer named Sikivu Hutchinson.
Yeah, she's going to be there in DC.
Okay, great. And one of the things she talks about a lot is how there is kind of this myth within the African American community that being African American, that there's this myth of the complete merging of the African American community and the Black churches. And she points out that, in fact, humanism and free thinking and atheism, there's a very strong stream of that in African American culture. I mean, it's, Frederick Douglass was a non-believer, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and Nora Zeal Hurston, and there's this long stream of atheism and secularism within that community that's kind of been squelched. I mean, it's part of the sort of general squelching of atheism in general. But I think that one of the things that we can do is, when we are sort of quoting our forebears, when we're saying, look at all the great atheists of history, we need to make a point of calling out, not just, Mark Twain and, Epicurus, but, to call out, these, women and people of color from our history, and to point out, the history of feminism, the history of the black culture is not actually tied up with religion. That there is also this secularist stream as well. Yes.
Bravo. It was intellectually challenging, and especially in the call to arms about following the pattern of the GLBT
Thanks.
movement. Nobody's arrested us for dancing yet. But I'd like to take it a step further.
Okay.
The marriage between the LGBT movement and the atheist movement today, having an identifiable, successful group of GLBT atheists or agnostics or what have you. There is an organization founded called GALA, Gay and Lesbians, Atheists, and Humanists. It is non-functional. There is money available to have that organization function.
Oh.
It would have, or some
Version.
like name or other organization function. It would make an extraordinary difference, I believe, in the atheist movement. Number one, just anecdotally, thinking about who's in this room, there seems to be a disproportionate number of members of the GLBT community who've rejected traditional religion. And I submit for social, logical reasons, you're going to judge me, well, I'm not going to play in your church. But there may be other reasons too. And so leadership within our movement could be furthered, and the success of our movement could be furthered, not just by imitation, but by cooperation and leadership. This movement had 5 or 6 years ago as a matriarch. Virtually every major non-theist movement in America was headed by a female. It's substantially less so now, almost, with one exception. There is a potential here to have this happen. You have a voice, and there are other people in this room that have a voice. I challenge you to get that going, to find an identity group movement. I'm not big on identity groups, but I will tell you, in the Secular Coalition for America, a lobbying group, the most valuable member of that organization, just because it lends its name, is the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers. That gets the Secular Coalition for America into Republican offices all the time. There is an outreach and a leadership that the GLBT community can do for this movement, and I beg you, or anyone in this room interested, to talk to me about it later to try to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, no.
And as they say, you go, girl.
Thanks. I mean, I agree. I think that there is tremendous potential for, there to be more visible, gay and lesbian leadership among atheists. Just so you know, one of the sort of things that we're coming against in doing that is the LGBT movement kind of doesn't want to know. The LGBT movement has very much hitched its wagon to the ecumenicalist religious star and towards progressive religion, and in a way that I find very frustrating. And that's very alienating to what my experience and the experience of a lot of LGBT atheists is that we're a lot more welcomed as queers in the atheist movement than we are as atheists in the queer movement. And there needs to be
that's just HRC though.
No, it's really not just HRC. I really wish it was. I mean, it's just a lot of the number of times that I've been to LGBT events and had people, doing prayer and invoking the God that we all believe in, and it's very frustrating. So, but that's not to say that we should give up. Obviously, that means we need to step up, step it up. Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in any ideas with regard to promoting atheism within the black community. I've worked in black communities for 20 or 30 years now, and it has been fascinating to see how atheism is treated up. I think it's, and I like you said that. I was like, I have time in my schedule to get over there.
May 16th.
I mean, that's fabulous. But I have to tell you, I've worked in this community, literally for decades, and I cannot find a way to discuss atheism or LGBTs. It's just, I mean, even with people who are pretty liberal.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying exclusively, because I
Yeah.
have plenty of friends that do believe those things, and are supportive of those things, but just on a general basis, it's about a 90% chance that I'll be shot down.
Yeah. No, I think I wish I had a better answer, and really, I think it would be better to talk with, African American atheists about that. They can probably give better answers than I can. But I think that there's sort of two things that we need to do to help, make better outreach into those communities. And one, again, is, like I was saying, is to talk more about, sort of the history of secularism and, rejection of religion within Black history itself, but also just to clean up our own shit, and to try to make sure. I was at the Atheist Alliance International conference in LA last year, and there were like 2 speakers of color, maybe 3, I think, and there was like 30 speakers, and there needs to be proactive action on the part of the atheist movement to try to get people of color and women into more positions of visibility, because I think that there is sort of this vicious circle where African Americans and women and other marginalized groups look at our movement and they see the 4 horsemen over and over again, and sometimes Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but mostly they see the 4 horsemen, and when that happens, they just are automatically just going to think, this isn't me, this doesn't have anything to do with me. So I think we need to really proactively at conferences and getting people in the news and all this stuff, just make an effort to make ourselves more diverse. Yeah.
In response to what you were asking, an idea that just kind of popped into my head would possibly, because like during Black History Month, possibly creating like an event about Black
That's a great
atheists
idea.
and stuff like that during Black History Month, because Black History Month is something that people are already going to be going to, those kinds of events, and then if you make an atheist one, they'll be like, well, it's a Black History thing, we might as well check it out.
I think it's a really good idea. So I think it's also something that if you organized it far enough in advance, you could get media attention to in a way that we don't. I think it's a really good idea. Any other questions?
Anybody notice that Black History Month is February, the shortest month?
Well, I have one more
Yeah.
question, but it might take a minute to respond to, which is, so one thing that's a little bit different with the Black church as opposed to any of the other groups is how strong the Black churches have been as a site of social justice. Even to this day, I mean, churches are sending full ride scholarship students to Harvard Divinity School to train like me. There's no funding whatsoever to train as a humanist in any way. So, I mean, it seems like they get so much support from the church and there's so much available to them that it kind of says, what do we have to offer to them? And the answer is pretty much social censure by your friends and no money.
And alienation from your family.
We can't, I think that one of the serious problems is that right now, all we can offer them is we'll be there to listen to you and we share your views on the subject. We can't offer them anything productive in a lot of these ways. And so until that situation changes, we won't be able to move forward. How do you see us best being able to break that dynamic?
No, that's not going to be a long answer. This is going to be a really short answer, which is I don't know.
That's a good answer too.
And I think that's a fair question. Is it's true that Black churches have been, it's more than just a source of religious support. It's a support of family and community and political organization and business relationships.
They're also not terribly theological. They're not necessarily consistent with each other. They're not consistent within their own church.
But of course, that's true for all religion. But
right, but especially so.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I think that's true and I think a lot of that's true for a lot of religion. A lot of people don't, not just people of color. A lot of people go to their churches not particularly because they care about God that much. I don't really have an answer, but I have a data point that I think will help. There was a recent poll asking about, religious belief and breaking it down by, gender and race and everything. And one of the things that I found was interesting is that, at least in America, rates of non-belief among African Americans are not actually significantly lower than they are among white people. It's roughly the same. What's different is that they don't feel comfortable coming out. And so the question is, how do you break that cycle? How do we encourage, and I think what we need, how do we encourage African American atheists to feel more comfortable coming out? And to some extent, as white people, we can't, I can't answer that question as a white person, but what I think that the atheist movement can do is, again, to clean up our own stuff. It's like if we make our own movement more really genuinely inclusive and not just sort of fake inclusive, if we make ourselves really more genuinely inclusive and genuinely more diverse, then I think people of color will feel more comfortable feeling like, okay, well, this is, if I'm gonna ditch, alienate my family and my friends, I have a real home to come to, and that's not just a home where I have to explain every 10 seconds about race.
Right.
Any other questions?